on the status quo is not what students, parents, or educators deserve. I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment and support the underlying bill that will empower the nation's parents, teachers, principals, and school administrators to deliver the educational system our students need, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Minnesota reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Holt.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
I'll probably reserve a time or two and then go to you.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of Mr. Miller's substitute and in opposition to the underlying bill. We must never forget that the Elementary and Secondary Education Act is rooted in the civil rights movement. Since 1965, the role of federal involvement in the schools has been to eliminate inequality in education, not just provide additional funds for schools to use as they please. This bill is not a thoughtful response to the concerns of parents and students and teachers and school officials. It takes several steps backwards. It reduces our investment in education. It would lock in the sequester spending cuts. It treats professional development as an afterthought. It would eliminate federal investment in science and math education. Yes, the Republican bill does mention science, but the proposal does nothing to tie high accountability measures to science assessments. A real proposal would not foster an exception that to that lack of improvement, that a lack of improvement is acceptable. A real proposal would have wraparound services. A real proposal would not abandon students with disabilities. A real proposal would not consider professional development as a mere afterthought. We should be considering a proposal that recognizes that federal investment and high standards in science and other areas, as well as literacy and foreign language development, are critical components to a high-quality education that every student deserves.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California reserve. The gentleman from Minnesota.
I reserve.
The gentleman from Minnesota reserve. The gentleman from California.
Could I inquire of the chair how much time I have available?
The gentleman from California has 5 minutes. The gentleman from Minnesota has 7 1/4.
And I have the right to close debate on the amendment?
No. The gentleman from Minnesota has the right to close.
On the substitute, the gentleman from Minnesota closes?
That is correct.
Thank you. I yield the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Polis, 1 minute.
The gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, and I want to respond briefly to some of Chairman Klein's introduction. I think both sides can agree that there are flaws in No Child Left Behind. AYP is a flawed formula. Personally, I think the answer reflected in the Democratic substitute is to get accountability right, not take a step back from accountability. The chairman mentioned that, quote, now we have more information about the quality of teachers in schools, end quote, thanks to No Child Left Behind. To his credit, in the initial draft bill, we replaced after 3 years the teacher evaluation system. However, unfortunately, that was amended here on the floor with the Scalise-Bishop amendment. So I think one thing we can be assured of in the underlying bill is it will lead to less information about the quality of teachers and any assurances that our federal funds are going to fund teachers that have any kind of qualification or, in fact, are effective. The Democratic substitute takes into account student growth, proficiency rates, graduation rates, and designs targeted interventions to help turn around our lowest performing schools. Whereas H.R. 5 guts education funding, the Democratic substitute provides funding for critical programs like STEM, school turnaround grants, safe and healthy students. This amendment would help invest in our nation teachers' quality. I strongly support the Democratic substitute and call on my colleagues to make sure that we move forward in education reform to help serve all kids in our great country. I yield back.
California reserves. The gentleman from Minnesota is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'll reserve again.
The gentleman from Minnesota reserves. The gentleman from California.
I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, the Republican bill unfortunately represents a missed opportunity. Everyone agrees that NCLB has flaws and needs to be updated and approved. It is disheartening that instead of working together on an actual reauthorization, we are once again debating a divisive partisan bill that only incorporates one ideology. There is nothing more important to our nation than educating our children. The most crucial element for ensuring our children's success is supporting our children's teachers. Teachers do an incredibly important and remarkably challenging job. The vast majority of them are excellent, and their good work is overlooked far too frequently. Education at the elementary and secondary level is critical to the development of a 21st century American jobs and global competitiveness. We need to get to work on a true bipartisan ESEA reauthorization.
The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 5 minutes now to the chairman of the subcommittee on early childhood, elementary and secondary education, the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Rokita.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the Chairman of Education Workforce for yielding such time. Well, here we are again. Perhaps the culmination of this debate that started yesterday afternoon here on the floor, but it's been going on in committee now for several weeks, and in this nation now for 12 years. Mr. Chairman, you know it's been 12 years since we've been on the floor debating these issues. I'm encouraged by that fact alone, that some of us had the leadership responsibility, the courage to bring some of these issues to the floor for the betterment of our teachers, our parents, and mostly our students. But I rise now in strong objection to the substitute amendment offered by my colleague from California. I oppose this amendment for a number of reasons, because it's more of the same, quote, Washington knows best, unquote, that's brought us here today. It turns out, as we hear from parents in our districts, Washington doesn't know best. A bureaucrat sitting in an office in Washington, by definition, Mr. Chairman, doesn't know our children and can't possibly know what's best for a student in Indiana or anywhere else in this nation. Who do you believe, Mr. Chairman, knows a child best? Is it the bureaucrats in this 10 or 11-story rectangle-like building known as the Lyndon B. Johnson Department of Education? Or is it this mother or this father who knows their child? Who do you trust, Mr. Chairman, with your children? Do you trust the bureaucrats in this building 1,000 miles away from where you live? Or do you trust you and your wife? Who do the parents of America trust more to educate their children, their local teacher or these bureaucrats? You know, throughout the amendment and debate process for the Student Success Act and the remarks offered now in support of this amendment, we've heard time and time again how the Student Success Act is an attack on children, teachers, and all other sorts of demagoguery and doom and gloom. Don't believe it. Don't believe it, because if you listen closely, and certainly if you read the plain meaning of the text of this amendment and everything else that's been written and said about these reforms that we're going to make here on the House floor today, you would find that at the very essence of all of them, we find that the other side and those that talk against the Student Success Act inherently trust these bureaucrats more than parents or teachers. They continuously say, we know best. We are smarter than those of us who raise our own children. The truth of the matter is that this amendment offered by my colleague is the real attack on children, parents, and teachers. It attacks teachers by holding them to Washington-based standards, not local ones, when we know, in fact, that every school is different. It attacks parents by robbing them of the hopes and dreams that they have for their children and takes away so many decisions that these parents can make to guide their children's future. They know best. Worst of all, this is an attack on children. Washington-based education policy attacks children by endangering their chance at success and a brighter future by hamstringing them with teaching to test results as opposed to teaching to success in life. The Student Success Act ensures parents can be in direct contact with those who are setting education policy for their children and their teachers and hold them accountable. There's a reason why this bill has received so much support from groups like the American Association of School Administrators, the Council of Chief State School Officers, the National School Boards Association, and the School Superintendents Association. They all support this bill. The Student Success Act will give states and schools the flexibility and incentive to administer their policies effectively. The Student Success Act encourages teachers to be innovative while also responsibly measuring success. It's been said here just recently and time again that, no, tenure and credentialism should be what we measure teachers against. I say no. It doesn't matter how long, Mr. Chairman, a teacher has taught or how many classes they've taken. What matters is how well their kids are learning, what their success is. And that's what the Student Success Act does. It will give parents the authority and choice that they deserve as they make decisions about their child's future, and it will give the students themselves the best opportunity to succeed. And that's the best thing we can do here on the floor of the House today. I yield back.
Gentleman, time expired. The gentleman from Minnesota reserved. Gentleman from California.
I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 30 minutes. 30 seconds. Whichever. 30 seconds.
Thank you. I rise today to speak against H.R. 5 and its impact on STEM education. As a physicist and someone who started a business in my parents' basement that manufactures over half the theater lighting equipment in the United States and provides hundreds of jobs in the Midwest, I know firsthand the importance of STEM education in driving our nation's innovation and competitiveness by generating new ideas, new companies, and new industries. And the impact of this underlying bill would be devastating to STEM education. Under H.R. 5, funding for STEM programs would be combined into a single block grant with 70 other education programs with no requirements for a school district to actually spend any funding on STEM education. I yield back and encourage a yes vote on the Miller substitute amendment.
Fired. The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make sure my colleague understands that I am prepared to close. I have no more speakers, and so I'll reserve until he's had a chance to have his speaker speak.
The gentleman from Minnesota reserved. The gentleman from California.
If I might inquire the chair's time I have left.
The gentleman from California has 3 minutes. The gentleman from Minnesota has 2 1/4. Gentleman from California.
I yield myself the remaining time.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, members of the House, this substitute that I've introduced on behalf of the Democrats creates a fundamental choice for this body in our vote later today. It creates a fundamental choice of whether or not this nation is going to go forward and provide a high-quality education to every student, or whether this nation is going to go back to a time when students are left out of this system, when resources weren't provided, when schools weren't keeping up. It's also a question of whether or not we're going to break a promise and go back on our constitutional responsibility to make sure that all students have access to that education. Poor students, minority students, English learning students, students with disability. Are we going to hold school districts and schools accountable for providing that educational opportunity for those students? And will those students have the same access to a high-quality education that in many instances is available across town, in the next neighborhood, but not there in their neighborhood, or isn't accessible because it's not friendly or welcoming to students with disabilities or students who are learning the English language? Will they have the same rights to that education? We know from this economy, from this economic downturn, we need every one of those students to be able to be productive and successful and achieving. But that's not what the Republican bill promises. It grinds down the funding available to these school districts for poor and minority children, for students with disabilities. It grinds it down because it marks it down to the sequestration label. So quietly and silently, school districts all over the nation are going to be losing the resources for these poor children. We're stealing money from the poorest people in this country to achieve deficit reduction. But tax reform maybe next year, the year after, the year after. Economic justice sometime later down the road. Today, this is about education justice and whether or not every student, every family is going to have access to a high-quality education that no longer depends upon their zip code or the neighborhood in a town in which they live. You know, it's been said very often from the other side that somehow all we want is a Washington knows best solution, and what they offer is something opposite of that. No, what we put together in this substitute is different than Washington knows best. This is about parents who know best. Parents who demand the accountability that is in the substitute and not in the Republican bill because they want to know if their child is learning in that school. Their child who may be poor, their child who may have disabilities, their child who may have learning problems. They want to know if their child is learning. This is parents who want to know best, teachers who want to know best, who want the resources so they can teach those children, the business community that wants a well-trained
The gentleman's time has expired.
educated workforce. They want to know what, and that's why the Business Roundtable, that's why the Chamber of Commerce opposes their bill. Educators
The
who want a
gentleman's
strong
time
system,
has expired.
that's why they oppose their bill. Parents who want it, that's why they oppose their bill.
The gentleman's time has
that.
expired.
No, who's running out of time?
The gentleman's
Children
time
are
has
running
expired.
out of time in this
The
nation.
gentleman will suspend.
Children are running
The
out of time
gentleman
in
will
this nation
suspend.
because they're grinding
The
down
gentleman
and
will
stealing
suspend.
their money. They're taking money
The
from
gentleman
the
is
poorest
not
families,
recognized.
the poorest children, and they're taking it away from those schools. That's the option that's here.
The gentleman
That's
it
the
will
choice that's
suspend
made.
is not recognized.
That's the choice that's made with
The
this
gentleman will
Constitution.
suspend.
That's the choice.
The
that's
gentleman
made.
will
The
suspend.
Constitution and these children's
The
rights to
gentleman will
education.
suspend is not
Thank you,
recognized.
Chair, for the time. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Minnesota is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, the House is in order.
The House is not in order. The gentleman from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We apparently agree on both sides of the aisle that parents should be making decisions. Parents should be in charge. Parents need information. We believe in the underlying bill that we are giving parents the information they need, the control they need, the choices they need, giving their children the best chance to succeed. I think we agree on both sides of the aisle. The status quo is not working. In fact, the administration is engaged in instituting its own education policy through its conditional waiver scheme. It's moved so far down the line, Mr. Chairman, that they've even offered waivers to the waivers. And yet it's been 12 years since this body, or the Senate, or the United States Congress, has passed an education law. 12 years. It is time for the Congress, the House, and the Senate to step up and do its job and write new law and get the administration out of the business of writing education policy. I would hope that Republicans and Democrats would recognize that it is not the role of the administration, of the Department of Education, of the Secretary, of the President, to write education policy, Republican or Democrat in the White House. It's our job to do it. It's time to do it. I don't believe the substitute amendment is the right thing. I oppose it. I'm asking my colleagues to oppose it. I believe the underlying bill moves us in the right direction, gives children a better opportunity. So I'm going to encourage my colleagues to oppose the substitute amendment, despite the passion that surrounds it, and support the underlying bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Minnesota yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
Recorded vote, Mr. Chairman.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California will be postponed. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, proceedings will now resume on those amendments printed in the House Report 113-158, on which further proceedings were postponed, in the following order. Amendment number 22, Mr. Culberson of Texas. Amendment number 24 by Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas. And also amendment number 26 by Mr. Miller of California. The chair will reduce to 2 minutes the minimum time for any electronic vote after the first vote in the series. The unfinished business is a request for a recorded vote on amendment number 22, printed in House Report 113-158 by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Culberson, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 22, printed in House Report number 113-158, offered by Mr. Culberson of Texas.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for recorded vote will rise and be counted. Sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote.
A few amendment votes leading up to a vote on final passage of an education bill in the House, rewriting the No Child Left Behind law for elementary and secondary schools. The bill removes the requirement for national standards and instead allows states to set their own standards. Here's more about the bill. Allison Klein, co-author of Education Week's Politics K-12 blog, joining us. What are some of the key changes being proposed in this rewrite of the No Child Left Behind education law?
Well, under this bill, states and school districts would have a lot more say over how they turn around the lowest performing schools, how they address the progress of all students when it comes to achievement, but especially poor and minority students and students in special education. And they'd also have a lot more flexibility in using federal funding.
Why do supporters of the bill say these changes are necessary?
Well, they say that the No Child Left Behind Act and even the administration's bid to make the No Child Left Behind Act less onerous for districts and states, which was through a series of waivers, still has too much, it's still too tough of a federal role on K-12 policy. So this will sort of relax federal standards for states and school districts and allow them to do what they think is best for schools and students, according to the bill's supporters.
On the other hand, critics of the bill say the changes will lead to lower academic standards. What do they mean by that?
Well, what they're saying is that the bill doesn't ask states and school districts to set particular achievement goals for student success as they do now under the No Child Left Behind Act and under the administration's plan to offer states waivers from the No Child Left Behind Act. So states wouldn't have sort of that federal hammer coming down on them, prodding them to make sure that these students are achieving.
Who are some of the opponents to the bill?
Well, there's a broad swath of opponents to the bill. Both teachers' unions oppose the bill, including the National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers, plus a whole host of civil rights groups, including the Education Trust and the National Council of La Raza. And then there are some surprising opponents to the bill, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is typically allied with Republicans.
The White House has issued a veto threat on the bill. What does the administration oppose on it?
Well, the administration thinks that this really waters down accountability for, especially for disadvantaged populations such as students in special education and English language learners. They do agree that No Child Left Behind was perhaps too onerous for states and school districts, but they see this as kind of going too far in the other direction.
What about outside groups? How much have they weighed in on the bill's rewrite?
A number of outside groups, if you're thinking about groups like Democrats for Education Reform, as I mentioned before, the Education Trust, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, those groups have all had, a very loud voice in opposing the bill. I should mention, though, that there are some groups who do support the bill, including the American Association of School Administrators and the National School Boards Association, as well as Americans for Tax Reform.
The law expired in 2007 and was a signature achievement of former President George W. Bush. Why have lawmakers let its authorization expire, and how has its requirement survived for 6 years without one?
Well, lawmakers let that authorization expire because, for one thing, they don't typically reauthorize very many laws on time, so No Child Left Behind is certainly in good company there. Also, as you know, the No Child Left Behind Act passed with broad bipartisan support back in 2001, right in the wake, actually, of September 11th, and there just hasn't been that kind of big bipartisan coming together since then. Still, a lot of folks agree that the No Child Left Behind Act is outdated, and the administration has offered nearly 40 states at this point waivers from many of its requirements.
Allison Klein is co-author of Education Week's Politics K-12 blog. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
The Associated Press is writing that the final vote on the GOP Student Success Act was expected to be close, with few or no Democrats in support, but that the ultimate outcome was certain. The White House said the bill would engender a veto, and the Democratic-led Senate is writing its own very different bill. As this vote continues, we'll hear about the effect of sequestration budget cuts and the White House's strategy in dealing with Congress from this morning's Washington Journal.
Stein is with the Huffington Post. He's political editor and White House correspondent. Thank you for joining us this
morning. Thanks for having me.
Let's talk about sort of the president's strategy right now. Here are some headlines from other publications. Politico asks, does President Obama have a second-term strategy? And then we see the use of the term hidden hand in a piece by Peter Baker at the New York Times. In the second term, Obama is seen as using hidden hand approach. We also were seeing some talks about potential deals between Republicans and the White House, perhaps coming out of these meetings. He's been holding these dinners. So what is the president's strategy at this point in terms of getting legislation passed and getting the public on his side?
Maybe it's a throw whatever you have against the wall and see what sticks strategy. You know, I think our profession kind of rushes to sort of put the big picture thing into one tiny box. It seems pretty clear to me that they're trying anything they can do. And with the knowledge that the House Republicans will probably in the end block it. But there's been some fruits of their labor right now. You see the Senate Republicans have come to an agreement on several things, including confirmations, immigration, et cetera. And now we're getting word of a renewed budget talks, for instance. I think that all that can be traced back to some of these dinners that he had, some of the outreach that has been done with White House Chief of Staff Dennis McDonough, in a general sense that they can work with that chamber. But like I said, you know, all the strategy and the gamesmanship is sort of for moot if John Boehner is going to stand in the way of anything. And so that might require a whole nother strategy.
What's the president's relationship like with Senate Democrats and House Democrats right now?
I think it's fine. I never thought it was a very close relationship. I mean, he was not there for that long. It was only 2 years before he started campaigning. If you talk to people in the Senate, he didn't build that great a relationship with any one person in the body. Maybe Tom Coburn is the exception, but he's a conservative. And with respect to congressional relations, you know, the White House is caught in this bind where, on the one hand, you know, they probably could be doing more. They probably could be working harder behind the scenes. On the other hand, if they put too much of their fingerprints on any legislative item, there's the risk that it will alienate a lot of Republicans. So, you know, they kind of are in a lose-lose situation. I don't think the president is particularly well regarded on the Hill, but I don't think his relationship is that bad as has been described in other publications.
Our guest, Sam Stein with the Huffington Post, has been tracking the effects of sequestration, which went into effect March 1st, and the Huffington Post has been continuing to look at what's going on. Here are some of his recent stories. Sequestration pushes Head Start families to the precipice, and we also see this. Sequestration cuts to research are like a slowly growing cancer. How much attention is this getting nationwide, and how much are Americans feeling it?
Well, that's a good question. Not getting much attention in terms of coverage in D.C., but if you look at local press coverage, it's everywhere. You can just set up a Google News alert for sequestration. You'll get dozens of clips a day, in part because a lot of the stuff is happening outside of the Beltway. What we set out to do was to just sort of tell the story of sequestration through the eyes of the people who were affected by it. And so with Head Start, for instance, we did a Google News search of anyone or any community suffering from Head Start cuts, and then we called that community and tried to talk to the parents of the kids in Head Start. And some of the stories are really sad. We're not getting a sense of the extent of the struggle that people are going through because of sequestration while we're in D.C., because a lot of the focus is just on top-line budget numbers. But if you just talk to these people, you get a sense that it's really hurting them.
We saw the New York Times report this, discussing the furlough concerns at military bases. The Defense Secretary has no good news.
There is no good news. The talks of replacing the sequestration are basically at a standstill. I can't even imagine or remember the last time I heard someone say, I want to introduce this bill to replace sequestration. And with respect to the furloughing of Defense Department employees, 2 weeks ago, a number of civilian Pentagon employees did a jog from the Pentagon to the nation's capital to try to raise awareness of this, of what's happening here. And they jogged alongside with them, which was which was hard because, you know, my questioning got a little bit more difficult as I was further along in the jog. I was breathing a little harder. But, you know, what they explained to me is that their lifestyles are changed. One woman I talked to said she hadn't gone out to a restaurant meal in 6 months because she was anticipating sequestration for that long. Another guy said, you know, working 4 days a week was really tough when your job is to basically monitor international satellites. You need 5 days a week to do that. So, you know, there are going to be impacts of sequestration. Part of what's problematic for people who want to replace it is that those impacts build up over time. They don't all happen at once, so people don't think the pain is right there.
Sam Stein with the Huffington Post. If you'd like to join the conversation, Democrats can call us at 202-585-3880. Republicans, 202-585-3881. Independents, 202-585-3882. Let's take a listen to comments that President Obama made back in April about sequestration. This is something that the Huffington Post has written about and your team took note of. And we'll listen in particular for the tone of where the responsibility lies with sequestration.
You seem to suggest that somehow these folks over there have no responsibilities and that my job is to somehow get them to behave. That's their job. They are elected, members of Congress are elected in order to do what's right for their constituencies and for the American people. So if in fact they are seriously concerned about passenger convenience and safety, then they shouldn't just be thinking about tomorrow or next week or the week after that. They should be thinking about what's going to happen 5 years from now, 10 years from now, or 15 years from now.
President Obama talking about Congress and laying the responsibility at Congress's feet for sequestration. Sam Stein, that's from a couple of months ago, so is that still the White House attitude? And what do we learn about the governing style of the president from those comments?
I mean, it's a complex legislative story because the nexus of sequestration was the budget deal in the summer of 2011. In order to get beyond the debt ceiling crisis, what the White House did was they offered sequestration as an alternative. And they never wanted to be put in that situation, but in order to resolve it, they did that. And the anticipation was that the stuff would be so ridiculously onerous, that the cuts would be so painful and illogical, which a lot of them are, that Congress would have to replace it. What they didn't calculate was that Congress's appetite for additional revenues would be so problematic, so they'd be so opposed to it that they would rather deal with sequestration. And so now we're at a place where the president is right on one hand that Congress needs to do something. He can't just wave a magic wand and say, voila, we fixed sequestration. On the other hand, it's really become you know, a game of chicken. Who would blink first? And in the meantime, as nothing happens, a lot of these cuts are taking effect to an incredible cost around the country.
Let's go to the phones and hear from Mike in Houston, Texas, on our Republicans line. Hi, Mike.
Hi, good morning.
Morning.
You know, the incredible costs around the country are the exact intent of the president. He wants to create pain and make people feel it so that he can justify government. Because Obama needs government, because he needs government to be the way and means of people's happiness, their pursuit of happiness, and their dependency. He doesn't want people being self-reliant. So when government is cut in any way, and this is not a cut, once and for all, the government is spending more this year than it did last year. That is a fact. And Obama can't lose this argument. He can't afford to lose this argument, because if the economy sustains itself at the poor rate that it is, he can't risk losing this argument. So pain has to be distributed while he can live the life of the top 1/4 of 1%. Let's make no mistake, Obama lives the life of the top 1% more than anybody in the United States.
More than anyone. I would grant the caller one thing, which is that this is in large part about the role that government plays in the lives predominantly of the poor people around this country, and whether or not we're going to have a robust or frayed social safety net. So in that respect, yes, a lot of this does have to do with government services. I would quibble with the idea that this is all a game to sort of get more people dependent on government. A lot of what sequestration is going to cut will end up having a very harmful impact on the private sector. So take, for instance, research grants. The NIH, National Institute of Health, is funding far fewer research grants now because of sequestration than it would prior to. I think about 700 grants are not going to be funded. Those create, you know, some of the medicines that revolutionize the type of surgeries, the type of medical coverage that we have in this country that the private sector then can build on. what we're going to end up doing, and I talked to a couple researchers and scientists for another piece I did, which is we're going to end up setting ourselves back generationally on this front to the detriment of not just public sector people or private sector people, but the country at large. We now have cures for, or therapies for a heart attack. If you want to live a life after a heart attack for 20 years, good life for 20 years, you need additional therapies. They are testing them out now. Those things are going to get delayed because of sequestration.
Let's look at some of the non-defense programs that were cut as part of sequestration. We see Head Start. We also see money coming from a Child Care and Development Block Grant, funding from WIC, the Women, Infants, and Children's Program, also childhood immunization grants, and some money from Title V of the Maternal and Child Health Services Block Grant. Are you hearing about the impact of those cuts?
Oh yeah, across the board. And after we did one of these pieces, you know, a bunch of people chimed in and said, well, you know, you're missing this part. Meals on Wheels, for instance, is one of those programs. We have a piece coming up Monday. I encourage everyone to go to thehuffingtonpost.com on how the Public Defenders Program, which is integral to the system of justice that we have in this country, public defenders are getting an incredible cut in their budgets, and they're experiencing furlough delays, caseload delays. Some of them are operating without investigators in their cases. Imagine being a lawyer without an investigator. Our criminal justice system is getting rocked because of sequestration. So it's happening across the board, but keep in mind it was supposed to happen across the board. It was supposed to be so widespread, so painful that eventually people would replace it, and it hasn't happened yet.
Comments on Twitter. C-SPAN Junkie writes in and says the House has passed some bills to fix sequestration and the Senate won't bring them up. And then we see from Ron, neither Congress nor the President wants to deal with the fallout of budget cuts, so the sequester is the only way we could have gotten cuts.
Well, it's true that the House passed a replacement bill, but the replacement bill would have been and is probably laughable to most Democrats at this point, which is that they basically reversed all of the defense cuts in there and kept all of the non-defense discretionary cuts, which is not exactly how you would define compromise in most situations. With respect to the Democrats, they are trying to get a sequester replacement bill that includes more revenues. It's been introduced. It hasn't passed the Senate, in part because of a 60-vote majority. But, you know, at some point, these two sides have to figure out what they can do in the middle. And the only hope that I've heard of from any lawmaker on the Hill is that in the upcoming budget negotiations, which are going to happen in September, around the debt ceiling again, that they will come to some sort of big agreement in which they will turn off the sequester and replace it with something a bit more responsible. I think that's the last remaining hope for doing this.
Democrats line Ron is in West Chesterfield, New Hampshire. Hi.
Hi. Good morning. Libby, it's you're very beautiful, very smart. C-SPAN is very lucky to have you.
Thanks, Ron. What's your comment for Sam Stein?
Yes, Mr. Stein, this was kind of a question for the previous guest, but hopefully you can answer it as well. I was wondering if you might have any kind of statistics on the first 6 years of this presidency, how much legislation has been passed through the House and the Senate during the first 6 years of this presidency, as opposed to the first 6 years of President Clinton's presidency, President Bush Sr.'s presidency, the first 6 years of President Jr.'s presidency. And I'm sure there's a huge disparity there as the legislation that has been passed during these 6-year periods. And I was wondering, what is your take on why this disparity is happening with this president as opposed to the first 6 years of these other presidents' presidencies? And I believe it's just a fight between the haves and the have-nots, basically. That's basically what it all comes down to. The Republicans want to spend the money on destroying nations and rebuilding them, and this administration would like to help the people of America, and I think that's where the big fight is at between the two parties.
Okay, Ron,
just different ideologies.
Let's get a response from Sam Stein.
Well, first of all, Ron, I'm upset that you didn't think that I, too, was beautiful and intelligent. But
you must be a friend of my parents.
I guess so. With respect to legislation passed, I don't have any hard figures on me, but my colleague Amanda Turkle did a piece recently about how this Congress was on pace to be the least productive Congress ever, basically, which gives you a sense of where we are. I think the first 2 years of this presidency, things obviously moved a bit more smoothly from his perspective because he had a 60-vote majority in the Senate for a period of time, and of course controlled the House of Representatives. You saw big legislative items happen in there. since then, it's kind of come to a standstill. There's been obviously some breakthroughs, and there's the potential for more, but my guess is that if you compare this presidency to past ones, it would be less productive, minus those first 2 years, although I'm guessing Google could probably give you a better answer than I can.
And our guest, Sam Stein's colleague, Amanda Turkle, had this piece. The 113th Congress is on pace to be the least productive in modern history. You can find that story at HuffingtonPost.com. Tommy, New York Republican. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you doing?
Okay, good. The caller just said that the Republicans just want to build, destroy countries and rebuild nations and rebuild them, and he was making like the Democrats just want to get. That's right. They don't want to destroy nations and rebuild them. What he's right about is about the Democrats just want to give money away. They have everyone bamboozled into thinking every time the VP, the President, Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid, if you notice, every time they talk, every time they have a speech, they throw in middle class in their speech. But they got all these young, stupid kids bamboozled into thinking that they're for the middle class. They're like Robin Hood. They just tax the middle class and give it to the poor. And no one cares about the middle class, not either party. That's my thing. So.
Sorry.
I mean, I guess, Tommy, I would disagree with some of that. I think that the deficit is going down under this president. I think that's a fact. Now, do we spend too much money? That's probably true, but I think it's indisputable fact that the deficit's going down. And with respect to taxing the middle class, the tax deal that was struck in January raised rates for people making over, I believe, $250,000, raised them up, but left everyone else intact. So unless you think middle class is above $250,000, then they're not taxing the middle class.
Let's talk about student loans. It looks like we're seeing a deal struck between a bipartisan group in the Senate to lower student loan rates. Who do you attribute that to, and what does that say for Congress?
Again, this is one of those cases in which the Senate is sort of disproving the common or conventional wisdom, which is that everything is dysfunctional. The Senate has actually produced some breakthroughs recently. Now we have one on student loans. Some of the more progressive members of the body are not happy with it. They wanted a fixed rate for student loans. This is going to be adjustable. There's a likelihood that it will rise in the next couple of years, even though it's starting fairly low. But, in terms of the politics and the legislative politics specifically, this is one of those cases in which there has been, gravitation towards being productive as opposed to being obstructionist on both sides. And, it remains to be seen what the House will do with it, but, it's one of those cases where you're actually seeing legislative activity.
Huffington Post story, the student loan deal is set to increase borrowing costs and swell government profit. A bipartisan Senate accord supported by the White House to overhaul the federal student loan program is forecast to boost government profit and increase borrowing costs in the coming years, leading student groups and some Democrats to denounce the deal. The compromise reached by 8 senators and blessed by the White House Thursday would result in an immediate reduction in borrowing costs under the federal student loan program.
Well, keep in mind, they have gone up. They've doubled because Congress failed to meet its deadline. And so what the Senate has decided to do is to get them down immediately. And I think retroactively, people, if they did take out a loan in this weird period where they did double, they would be helped out too. Although it's very rare that people take out loans at this time of year. But these could adjust up, and they seem likely to adjust up. And what my colleague there was writing about is the fact that we're now in the situation where the government does reap the profit of the student loans. They took out the middleman, and so they're the ones who the money goes to, and this could end up boosting government revenues. And people like Elizabeth Warren have said, well, why do that when you can give cheaper loans to students? Why not get it at a fixed rate? I'm not sure what the response is. I wish I knew it.
Sam Stein with the Huffington Post. What do you learn about the White House from deal brokering like this? The White House, as Huffington Post reports, has blessed this agreement. What does it say about President Obama's leadership style and strategy?
Well, they like to, I think it really does depend on legislative topic. I mean, in some cases they like to be out in the forefront. They want to be the people who are leading the charge. So with sequestration, which we've been talking about, the president went on the road, talked about how it was going to affect communities. He went to specific spots to sell the idea that they need to replace it. With respect to things like immigration reform, he's very strategically been out of the scene. He doesn't want his fingerprints on it. He knows that if he were to endorse something, it would give ammunition to the other side to oppose it. And so, you know, student loans is one of those cases in which they were working behind the scenes. They clearly were involved in negotiations, and they blessed an agreement because they want to move the ball forward. They want to get a resolution. And I think the undertone of all of this, including the agreement to do these confirmations, is that the President and his team realizes that the clock is beginning to tick. You know, you have 3.5 years of your presidency left, and you can't sit around waiting for your, you know, Consumer Financial Protection Board director to be confirmed, even, you know, after it's been well over a year. And so they're starting to get a little bit more anxious about getting stuff done, and I think you're going to see them put the foot on the gas as much as they can.
Milford, Ohio. Randy is an independent. Hi, Randy.
Good morning there, folks.
Morning.
You know, based on looking at you two people on the TV, you look like you're about the same age as my sons, which are 38 and 34 years old.
I'm younger.
Now, I preface that because I'm wondering what the world's going to look like for them 20 years from now. And when I was being raised, my dad and mom had 6 kids, and my mother never worked at a job, and they were able to support a house and a home without going into debt. And right now you have a situation where the federal government borrows 42% or so of its budget from future generations. So what I'm saying is, what do you think the world's going to look like in the future when the government it seems to me to be doing too much? And I mean, it sounds to me, listening to you, Sam, that you really believe in government activism, and the government's supposed to solve all these problems, including putting kids through school with the federal student loans. I got my 2 boys to.
196, the amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is a request for a recorded vote on amendment number 24, printed in House Report 113-158 by the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 24, printed in House Report number 113-158, offered by Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas.
Recorded vote having been requested, those in support of a recorded vote will stand and be counted. A sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote.
Members voting on an amendment that would create a report with recommendations for states in monitoring schools. The overall education bill would eliminate more than 70 existing elementary and secondary education programs, replacing them with block grant money that states and school districts could use as they think best. The Senate is expected to take the first action on another education issue. The National Journal writes that despite the possibility of some Democratic opposition, a deal brokered by senators to roll back interest rates on some student loans is poised to come to the Senate floor next week. The agreement puts the Senate closer to positions held in the House and by the President. And a story in CQ Roll Call says that in the wake of the deal, lawmakers said they intend to launch a policy debate re-examining all aspects of federal student aid programs when they take up a reauthorization of the Higher Education Act this fall.
On this vote, the yeas are 186, the nays are 237. The amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business request for recorded vote on amendment number 26, printed in House Report 113158 by the gentleman from California, Mr. Miller, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the no vote was prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 26, printed in House Report number 113-158, offered by Mr. George Miller of California.
Recorded vote having been requested, those in favor of recorded vote will stand and be counted. Sufficient number having arisen. Recorded vote is ordered. The members will record their vote by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote.
This amendment would replace the text of the education bill with another version. The Wall Street Journal reports that the Senate may have recently reached a deal on nominees to the executive branch, but a battle still awaits on President Obama's judicial nominees. Democrats will push for progress on 3 nominees for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. But some Republicans accused Obama of trying to pack the court. It's unclear whether Senate Democrats will use a potential change to Senate rules as a way to maneuver around potential challenges from Republicans. That in the Wall Street Journal. The Senate this week confirmed Gina McCarthy to head the EPA, Tom Perez as Labor Secretary, Fred Hochberg for another term at the Export-Import Bank, and Richard Cordray to continue at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. This is the last amendment vote in this series. Up next, a few minutes of debate, a procedural vote, then a vote on final passage of the education bill.
On this vote, the yeas are 193, the nays are 233. The amendment is not adopted. The The question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Accordingly, under the rule of the committee rises.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union had under consideration H.R. 5. And pursuant to House Resolution 303, I report the bill back to the House with the amendment adopted in the Committee of the Whole.
The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration the bill H.R. 5 and pursuant to House Resolution 303 reports the bill back to the House with an amendment adopted in the Committee of the Whole. Under the rule, the previous question is ordered. Is a separate vote demanded on any amendment to the amendment reported from the Committee of the Whole? If not, the question is on adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The question is on the engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed will say no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
A bill to support state and local accountability for public education, protect state and local authority, inform parents of the performance of their children's schools, and for other purposes.
The House will be in order. 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 For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New Hampshire seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have a motion to recommit at the desk.
Is the gentlewoman opposed to the bill?
Yes, I am.
The gentlewoman qualifies. The clerk will report the motion.
Ms. Custer of New Hampshire moves to recommit the bill H.R. 5 to the Committee on Education and the Workforce with instructions to report the same back to the House forthwith with the following amendments. Page 23, after line 9, insert the following new subparagraph. F, guaranteeing educational opportunities for children with autism or other disabilities. Each state plan shall demonstrate that the academic content standards and academic achievement standards adopted under this paragraph do not deny educational opportunities.
Mr. Speaker,
what purpose does the gentleman from...
I reserve a point of order against the motion.
The point of order is reserved. The clerk will report.
Adopt lower standards than the standards adopted for students without disabilities or otherwise lower expectations for students with disabilities, including children with autism.
Speaker.
Page 481, after line 22, insert the following. Section 5552, protecting school children from sexual predators. A, background
Mr. Speaker.
checks.
Gentlewoman from New Hampshire is recognized.
Thank you. I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading of the amendment.
Is there objection? There's no objection. Without objection, so ordered. Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is the final amendment to the bill, which will not kill the bill or send it back to committee.
And the House is not in order. Please remove your conversations from the House floor.
If adopted, the bill will proceed immediately to final passage as amended. This week, we have debated how best to educate our children and prepare them for the lives and jobs of the 21st century economy. Mr. Speaker, this bill is not the answer. In New Hampshire, we recognize that investments in education are investments in economic growth, job creation, and expanded opportunity for middle-class families. Unfortunately, this...
The House is not in order. Please remove your conversations from the